The 1960s gave us some of the most iconic music of all time, but it wasn't all peace, love, and rock and roll. Today, we're diving into the groups that had one hit and then fell completely off the radar. This is the list of the 20 worst gone groups of the 1960s. 20. The Music Explosion. The Music Explosion hit it big with a million-selling single. But what came next was anything but glamorous. Their story is one of brief fame, rip-offs, and bitter disappointment. Let's dive into how this Ohio band went from chart toppers to complete obscurity. The Music Explosion were a 5-piece band from Mansfield, Ohio. They were discovered by record producers Jerry Cassinetts and Jeffrey Katz. Cassinetts and Katz also signed the bubblegum pop acts 1910 Fruit Gum Company and the Ohio Express, and produced Ram Jam's 1977 hit Black Betty. Their 1967 song Little Bit O' Soul is one of the highest charting songs on the Nuggets set, reaching number 2 on the Billboard charts. The song was written by British writers John Carter and Ken Lewis, best known for penning the 1965 Herman Hermann's hit, Can't You Hear My Heartbeat? Before becoming a songwriting team, Carter and Lewis formed the band Carter Lewis and the Southerners, briefly featuring Jimmy Page on guitar. Little Bit O' Soul was originally recorded by British band The Little Darlings in 1965, but the Music Explosion's version is the definitive version. On the band's soul album, Cassinetts and Katz wrote several of the tracks, which were blatant rewrites of existing songs. Bassist Burton Stahl later acknowledged these claims. First off, if you play the Music Explosion track titled Can't Stop Now, and then play the song called Up and Down by John Fred and the Playboy Band, one of their 45s on Paula, as well as a track on their Judy in Disguise LP, you will find that Can't Stop Now is a note-for-note complete ripoff of the John Fred tune, right down to the exact melody and phrasing. To no surprise, the song was actually written and recorded by John Fred first. I had mentioned this to John Fred in an interview that I did with him several years ago, before his recent death, and John readily acknowledged that he was fully aware of the Music Explosion ripoff tune. Needless to say, John was pissed as hell about it, especially because the Music Explosion track was not listed as John Fred being the writer of this song. The Music Explosion were unable to capitalize on the success of Little Bit O' Soul. None of their other singles cracked the top 50, and their soul album was unsuccessful. 19. Eternity's Children. Eternity's Children started as a folk group but quickly evolved into sunshine pop, hoping to ride the wave of catchy harmonies and breezy tunes. But behind the scenes, it was chaos, bad management, endless lineup changes, and failed record deals. Let's explore how it all went wrong. Eternity's Children was an American sunshine pop band that originated in Cleveland, Mississippi as a folk group known as the Phantoms. The Phantoms began with 2 students, composed of vocalist keyboardist Bruce Blackman and drummer Roy Whitaker. Soon, the group added lead guitarist Johnny Walker, rhythm guitarist Jerry Bounds, and bassist Charlie Ross, and began developing the complex, overlapping vocal harmonies that were utilized when they became Eternity's Children in 1967. They quickly recorded a demo that made its way to A&M, and in the spring of 1967, recorded their lone effort for the label, the single Wait and See. The record went nowhere, and they were quickly dropped by A&M, but Roy soon landed them a deal with Capitol's tax shelter subsidiary, Tower. Under Tower, the band released their most successful single, Mrs. Bluebird, BW Little Boy. Mrs. Bluebird became a modest hit despite the limited promotion and was a prime example of the group's vocal harmonies. It reached number 69 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 58 in Canada. But success would be short-lived as the single dropped off the chart after 3 weeks. Its follow-up, Sunshine Among Us, was less successful. peaking at number 117 on the Billboard Bubbling Under chart in September of the same year. During work on the band's debut studio album, managerial and musical indifference caused Blackman, Bounds, and Walker to exit from band activity. Blackman, regarding the tension, stated, "We did not survive because of incredibly bad management. After I left the group, they tried to cheat me out of any credit. Only keyboardist Mike Kid McLean would be included as a replacement, and the remaining members of Ross, Whitaker, and Lawley would continue to record the album." Eternity's Children would be released in 1968 and became a local interest in Los Angeles for its style set in psychedelic pop and sunshine pop, but failed to chart nationally. Producers Olsen and Betcher utilized studio musicians, so it is difficult to definitively depict who is playing on a given track. Despite the disappointment of the group's debut album, Eternity's Children reconvened with a new producer, Gary Paxton. Bruce Blackman, the main songwriter of their past album, left the band before recording began, leaving Ross, Lawley, and McLean to contribute to the all-original material for the album. Percussionist Bo Wagner replaced Whitaker and took part in the 1969 single "Till I Hear It From You," BW I Wanna Be With You. When the single did not chart, Capitol Records withdrew the American release of their second album, Timeless. It did receive a limited release in Canada, however, where Mrs. Bluebird was most successful. But with the high asking price, not many fans of the band bought the album, and it has since become a difficult item to find. With the botched second album, the remaining members of Eternity's Children moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and were matched with a different producer, Chips Moman, to produce a third album. That album never materialized, but the group continued to release more singles on the Capitol label throughout 1969. When Capitol cut business relations with the group, they moved to independent labels back in Mississippi the following year to record more singles. Those met with little success, however, and Eternity's Children disbanded while variations of the group continued to tour until 1974. 18. Gary Pucket and the Union Gap. Gary Pucket and the Union Gap had it all: the image, the voice, and a string of hits that defined a generation. But behind the Civil War era costumes and heartfelt ballads, creative tensions were brewing. So what tore this band apart? Gary Pucket and the Union Gap, initially credited as the Union Gap featuring Gary Pucket, was an American pop rock group active in the late 1960s. Their biggest hits were Woman, Woman, Over You, Young Girl, and Lady Willpower. Formed in 1967, Gary Pucket and the Union Gap came out of the state of Washington and took their name from the nearby city of Union Gap. In addition to Pucket on vocals and guitar, the group also included Kerry Chater, bass, Dwight Beament, sax, Paul Wheatbread, drums, and Gary Mother Witham, keyboards. Taking a nod from the Revolutionary War costumed Paul Revere and the Raiders, the group dressed in stage costumes reminiscent of Civil War era Union soldiers. Pucket brought a demo to songwriter record producer Jerry Fuller. The pair met just as Fuller was hanging the gold record on his office wall, awarded to him for writing Ricky Nelson's massive hit Travelin' Man. Fuller was impressed enough with the material and Puckett's drive to catch one of their gigs at a bowling alley. Soon, the band was under contract to Columbia Records, with Fuller both producing and co-writing much of their material. Several albums and hit singles followed, but Pucket, wanting more control of and say in the material, eventually split with Fuller. The group eventually grew unhappy with doing material written and produced by others, leading them to stop working with Fuller. The band eventually disbanded, and Pucket went on to do both solo work and collaborations. The breaking point apparently came when Fuller recruited a 40-piece orchestra for a session that the group left in a huff. Chart hits began to dry up. Pucket launched a solo career in 1970, and he officially disbanded the group the next year. Young girl, get out of my mind. 17. Iggy and the Stooges. Iggy Pop and the Stooges didn't just play rock music, they embodied chaos, rebellion, and a total disregard for convention. With tracks like I Wanna Be Your Dog, they were on the brink of something big, but internal turmoil tore them down. Iggy and the Stooges, American rock band initially active in the late 1960s and early 1970s that helped define punk music. Both with the Stooges and in his subsequent solo career, Iggy Pop had a far-reaching influence on later performers. The principal members of the band were vocalist Iggy Pop, bassist Dave Alexander, guitarist Ron Ashton, and drummer Scott Ashton. In 1967, Osterberg formed the Psychedelic Stooges, taking the name Iggy Stooge. In 1969, its name shortened to the Stooges. The band released its eponymous first album, produced by the Velvet Underground's John Cale. I Wanna Be Your Dog and No Fun became proto-punk classics, mixing raw, abrasive rock with insolent lyrics. Destructively energetic and furious, the debut in the band's second album, Funhouse, 1970, along with Iggy's outrageous onstage performances in which he smeared himself with peanut butter and rolled on broken glass, secured the band's cult status. In 1973, the group released Raw Power, with production help from David Bowie, before disbanding the following year. 16. Grand Funk Railroad. They were the band critics loved to hate. Grand Funk Railroad's gritty, working-class rock and roll made them heroes to fans and pariahs to the press. But behind the massive tours and hit records, things weren't as solid as they seemed. One of 1970's most successful hard rock bands, in spite of critical pans and somewhat reluctant radio airplay, Grand Funk Railroad built a devoted fan base with constant touring, a loud, simple take on the blues rock power trio sound, and strong working-class appeal. The band first achieved recognition at the 1969 Atlanta International Pop Festival after their local promoter, Jeep Holland, got them the slot for no monetary compensation, and after opening the first day, the band went down so well that they were invited to appear on all 3 days. This exposure proved to be invaluable, and the band was signed by Capitol Records, where their manager, Knight, was working as an A&R person. After a raucous, well-received set on the first day of the festival, Grand Funk was asked back to play at the 1970 Atlanta International Pop Festival 2 the following year. Patterned after hard rock power trios such as Cream, the band, with Terry Knight's marketing savvy, developed its own popular style. From the beginning, Terry Knight promoted Grand Funk as if they were a supergroup and a champion of the people. A trailer trash Malcolm McLaren, Knight quickly realized the Funk's basic, high-energy Neanderthal stomp would never get aired on the radio. The band's only chance to get heard was to tour constantly until they could get their message through to the record companies, all of which, bar none, had rejected their demo. The press was certainly not on Grand Funk's side either. This was, in fact, the beginning of a vehemently hate-hate relationship. They were called the worst band of all time by Rolling Stone magazine. A typical review at the start of the band's career read, Grand Funk are one of the most simplistic, talentless, one-dimensional, unmusical groups of the year. Absolutely unbelievable. It got worse. 15. C-Train. C-Train started with members of The Blues Project and mixed rock, bluegrass, and jazz into a unique sound. They had the chops and even George Martin's production, but constant lineup changes and bad luck kept them from breaking through. C-Train was an American roots fusion band based initially in Marin County, California, and later in Marblehead, Massachusetts. C-Train was formed in 1969, subsequently drawing some members from the Blues Project upon its breakup. The group, which recorded 4 albums, disbanded in 1973. Roots fusion combo C-Train formed from the ashes of the Blues Project, following the exits of the New York-based group's other members. Though the group's 1968 album Planned Obsolescence was issued under the Blues Project name out of contractual obligations, the sextet immediately rechristened itself C-Train to release a self-titled 1969 LP highlighted by their unique blend of rock, bluegrass, folk, and blues. A series of roster changes plagued the group in the months to follow, however, and in 1970, C-Train released their second album, also eponymously titled, scoring a minor hit with the single 13 Questions. George Martin produced the album, marking the first time he had acted in that capacity with a rock act since his work with the Beatles. He also produced C-Train's much-anticipated 1971 follow-up album, The Marblehead Messenger. In September, C-Train toured Great Britain for the first time, usually performing as a support act for Traffic. However, Rowan and Green left the band soon after to form Muleskinner, while Roberts and Adam Anuik joined the backing band of Emmylou Harris. Kohlberg and Baskin replaced these members with guitarist Peter Walsh, keyboardist Bill Elliott, and drummer Julio Coronado, but released only one more album, 1973's Watch. 14. Jerry and the Pacemakers. Once seen as the friendly rivals of the Beatles, Jerry and the Pacemakers couldn't keep up with the times. Their upbeat Merseybeat sound was no match for the psychedelic and experimental styles that took over. Let's see why they didn't last. Jerry and the Pacemakers were a British rock band that rose to prominence in the early 1960s as part of the Merseybeat musical movement centered around Liverpool. They are best known for hits like Ferry Cross the Mersey and You'll Never Walk Alone. The band achieved significant commercial success in the early 1960s with several top 10 hits in both the UK and US. However, their popularity and chart performance began to decline by the mid-1960s. There are a few key reasons why Jerry and the Pacemakers ultimately failed to maintain their initial level of success. As the 1960s progressed, musical tastes and genres began shifting away from the upbeat, guitar-based Merseybeat sound that Jerry and the Pacemakers specialized in. The rise of psychedelic rock, folk rock, and other emerging genres made their styles seem more dated and less commercially viable. As Jerry and the Pacemakers' contemporaries, the Beatles rapidly eclipsed them in terms of worldwide popularity and critical acclaim. The Beatles' ability to evolve their sound and songwriting overshadowed Jerry and the Pacemakers' more limited musical range. Jerry and the Pacemakers struggled to develop their sound and songwriting beyond their initial hit formula. They were unable to keep up with the rapid musical changes of the 1960s and failed to introduce innovative or experimental elements to their work. After a string of early hits, Jerry and the Pacemakers' singles began to perform poorly on the charts, failing to crack the top 10 after 1965. This declining commercial performance ultimately led to the band breaking up in the late 1960s. In summary, the combination of changing musical trends, competition from more innovative peers, and their inability to evolve their sound led to the eventual decline and failure of Jerry and the Pacemakers as a major musical act.
Don't let the sun catch you cry.
13. The Golder Briars. With Kurt Betcher at the helm, the Golder Briars were supposed to be the next big thing in folk pop, but despite their talent and unique harmonies, they never broke through. What went wrong for this forgotten band from Minnesota? In the spring of 1964, a new folk group such as the Golder Briars had an awful lot of competition. Leaving aside the impending cultural juggernaut being piloted by Bob Dylan, there was Peter, Paul and Mary, the New Christie Minstrels, the Kingston Trio, the Limelighters, a 23-year-old called Joan Baez, and Seattle's Brothers Four. All were selling huge numbers of LPs and concert tickets. Then there were the new groups, acts like the Serendipity Singers, Minty Fresh RCA Victor Signing's The Women Folk, folk scion John Hammond Jr., and Horizon Records' Barbara Dane and Oriel Smith, who would go on to record the incredible Tiffany Glass LP in 1968. Meanwhile, Epic Records was preparing to launch its own new folk troupe, the Golder Briars. Outwardly, there was nothing much to differentiate this gentle-mannered four-piece from any of the above, until, that is, you listen to the record itself, for this is a truly strange and remarkable album, thanks largely to their brilliant 20-year-old guitarist, singer and arranger, Kurt Betcher. The Golder Briars from Minnesota were a folk group that was active from February 1963 through June 1965. During their 29 months together, they were in constant transition, starting out as a folk group and then moving to folk pop and then to folk pop rock. Although they never had a hit record as they hoped for, their unique vocal harmonies had an influence on other folk pop artists at the time. They recorded 2 obscure albums for Epic Records in 1964 before adding drummer Ron Edgar to their lineup, who would later be a part of the groups The Music Machine and The Millennium. They recorded a 3rd album in late 1964. A single from this proposed album, June Bride Baby, BW I'm Gonna Marry You, was released in early 1965, but the group broke up afterwards and the album remains unreleased.
Honey from the white, honey from the red, red rose, I wanna be with my honey tonight.
12. Shocking Blue. Shocking Blue took the world by storm with their hit Venus, a song so iconic you probably still hear it today. But after that, the Dutch band struggled to keep their momentum, eventually fizzling out. Here's how they went from number 1 to nowhere. Formed in 1967 in the Netherlands with members Robbie Van Leeuwen on guitar and sitar, Fred de Wilde on vocals, Klaasje van der Wal as the bassist, and Cor Vanderbeek on the drums. They didn't achieve much mainstream success, only having a few singles to their name. This inevitably led to the 1968 departure of Fred de Wilde. The band's most memorable feature, Mariska Veres, joined the band that same year, bringing a new look and sound to the group. Described as the Dutch Grace Slick, her heavy coal-rimmed eyes and her long-banged wigs made her an automatic sex symbol. After her arrival, the band recorded their biggest hit, Venus. You'll recognize it from the Gillette razor commercials. The song reached number 1 on US Billboard's Hot 100 in 1970, but they did not receive any more major radio play in the US. To me, that is an utter tragedy, as they are the perfect hippie 70s mix band. They're not thought-provoking songs, but they are just so catchy and fun to listen to that anybody can find one song of theirs that they like. What's even more impressive is that Mariska didn't know any English when she was on lead vocals, so everything she sang was done phonetically. It's hard to even pinpoint when the language barrier gets in the way. The power behind her voice transcends the limitations of language. The band broke up in 1974, leading to the solo careers of Robbie Van Leeuwen and Mariska Veres. They had several band reunions stretching up until the deaths of Cor Vanderbeek in 1998 and Mariska Veres in 2006. 11. Spike Drivers. Spike Drivers had all the makings of a great 1960s band. Catchy lyrics, psychedelic undertones, and a unique folk rock vibe. But despite some minor hits, they never quite caught on. Let's take a look at why this band from Detroit faded into obscurity. Not to be confused with Spike Drivers, the Spike Drivers is one of those bands that is classically, unabashedly 60s in style. Like many of the rock groups on this list, there's a lot of surfer rock influences and quite a bit of deep psychedelic undertones to their music. When you add those very fun elements to their catchy, easy to sing to lyrics, you get a great band. Despite having had some minor hits, the music they produced never really caught on enough to get an imprint on public memory. As a result, they are one of the better forgotten 60s rock bands out there. Unfortunately, because they've become so obscure, they don't even have a Spotify for their music. The Spike Drivers began by working in various coffee houses and clubs in the Detroit, Michigan folk rock music scene. Their music was rooted in folk, blues, and classical music. The band name was suggested by its vocalist, Mary Carol Brown, originating from a song about John Henry by Mississippi John Hurt called Spike Driver Blues. The band shared the stage with performers such as Joni Mitchell and Del Shannon. The band traveled to New York City and landed a recording contract with Warner Brothers Reprise Records, where they put out 2 45s featuring Strange Mysterious Sounds with Break Out the Wine and Often I Wonder with High Time. The band was showcased at many clubs in the New York area, with a high point occurring when they opened for Eric Burdon and the Animals at the Rheingold Central Park Music Festival in 1966. Ted Lucas and Richard Keelan left the band in 1967 to record as the Misty Wizards. They were replaced in the Spike Drivers by Marshall Rubinoff and Ron Cobb. After both groups dissolved, Lucas released a self-titled solo album. Keelan relocated to Canada and performed in the Perth County Conspiracy, and Sid Brown released albums as part of the music collective Peace, Bread, and Land Band, who had 4 LPs between 1969 and 1978. Former member Steve Booker came to be known as Maruga Booker and still records and performs today. Rubinoff, who was married to actress Lynn Shay, relocated from Detroit to San Francisco after his attempts to form another band following the dissolution of the Spike Drivers failed. He died there in a motorcycle accident on July 7, 1968, a few days past his 24th birthday. 10. The Jimi Hendrix Experience. They were led by one of the greatest guitarists of all time, but the Jimi Hendrix Experience didn't last long. 3 albums, epic performances, and internal chaos defined their short run. Here's how the experience turned into a missed opportunity. Musician James Marshall Jimi Hendrix is one of the most legendary guitar players of all time. Even if you're not a big music buff, you've probably heard his name time and time again and know exactly what shot him to fame. It was the formation of his rock band, the Jimi Hendrix Experience in 1966, that began it all. The group consisted of Hendrix, drummer Mitch Mitchell, and bassist Noel Redding, with Billy Cox later replacing him for a brief time. Though they lasted just under 3 years, putting out 3 albums from 1966 to 1969, they're still revered in the echelons of music history. Amazingly, Hendrix would only record 3 fully conceived studio albums in his lifetime. Axis, Bold as Love, and the double LP Electric Ladyland were more diffuse and experimental than Are You Experienced? On Electric Ladyland in particular, Hendrix pioneered the use of the studio itself as a recording instrument, manipulating electronics and devising overdub techniques with the help of engineer Eddie Kramer in particular to plot uncharted sonic territory. Not that these albums were perfect, as impressive as they were, the instrumental breaks could meander, and Hendrix's songwriting was occasionally half-baked, never matching the consistency of Are You Experienced, although he exercised greater creative control over the later albums. His guitar playing is ridiculously monotonous, and his songs drag on way too long, and his voice isn't much better. He almost always sounds incredibly bored when he sings, and when he tries to sing with any emotion at all, he often becomes downright unintelligible. I could name about a dozen guitarists who sound less boring and have much better singing voices pretty easily if I wanted to. The final 2 years of Hendrix's life were turbulent ones musically, financially, and personally. He was embroiled in enough complicated management and record company disputes, some dating from ill-advised contracts he'd signed before the Experience formed, to keep the lawyers busy for years. He disbanded the Experience in 1969, forming the Band of Gypsies with drummer Buddy Miles and bassist Billy Cox to pursue funkier directions. While outside parties did contribute to bogging down Hendrix's studio work, it also seems likely that Jimmy himself was partly responsible for the stalemate. Unable to form a permanent lineup of musicians, unable to decide which musical direction to pursue, unable to bring himself to complete another album despite jamming endlessly. In his brief 4-year reign as a superstar, Jimi Hendrix expanded the vocabulary of the electric rock guitar more than anyone before or since. Hendrix was a master at coaxing all manner of unforeseen sonics from his instrument, often with innovative amplification experiments that produced astral quality feedback and roaring distortion. His frequent hurricane blasts of noise and dazzling showmanship, he could play and would play behind his back and with his teeth and set his guitar on fire, have sometimes obscured his considerable gifts as a songwriter, singer, and master of a gamut of blues, R&B, and rock styles. Hendrix recorded a massive amount of unreleased studio material during his lifetime. Much of this, as well as entire live concerts, was issued posthumously. Several of the live concerts were excellent, but the studio tapes have been the focus of enormous controversy for decades.
But they don't realize the ones who swear.
9. Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath are metal legends now, but in the 70s, things weren't so clear-cut. Drug abuse, infighting, and questionable creative choices led to a period of chaos for the band that nearly ended it all. How did they pull through? Let's find out. Black Sabbath, heavy metal's founding fathers, purveyors of the almighty riff, and universal influencers of all heaviness thereafter, stand as one of the most important figures in all of recorded music, and this notion is not lost half a century after the release of their first album. Black Sabbath were an English rock band formed in Birmingham in 1968 by guitarist Tony Iommi, drummer Bill Ward, bassist Geezer Butler, and vocalist Ozzy Osbourne. They are often cited as pioneers of heavy metal music. The band's first 6 records represent arguably the greatest album streak in metal's history. Sabotage is the album where Sabbath stretched themselves to breaking point. It might not have the laden consistency of Master of Reality or doom pop immediacy of Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, but for its hard rock brinkmanship and sheer ambition on display, it takes some beating. It quickly fell apart from there, however, as drug abuse rattled the band's creativity and interpersonal relationships. Technical Ecstasy 1976 and Never Say Die 1978 had fleeting bright moments, but were mostly marred by outlandish stylistic heaves of desperation that had no business being touted as music made by Black Sabbath. Ultimately, those 2 records broke the band and necessitated the firing of Ozzy Osbourne, who was spiraling further out of control than any other member of the group. Everyone sensible loves Black Sabbath. That's a fact, and you're welcome to it. But despite the seminal, pioneering, and resolutely monstrous glory of the British legend's many and much celebrated creative peaks, there have been plenty of missteps, stumbles, and sliced shots over the course of the last 48 years. And we don't just mean that iffy album with Glenn Hughes on it. 8. Pinkertons' Assorted Colors. Pinkertons' Assorted Colors had an electric auto harp and a quirky stage presence that set them apart. But despite their colorful image and catchy tunes, their success was fleeting. Let's look at what made this band stand out, and why they didn't last. Formed in Rugby in 1964, the first lineup of this band, originally known as the Liberators, was Samuel Pinkerton Kemp on auto harp and vocals, Tony Newman on rhythm guitar, Tom Long on lead guitar, Barry Bernard playing bass, and John Wallbank on the drums. Following a brief hookup with producer Shel Talmy, which resulted in one single, Wallbank exited the lineup to be replaced by Dave Holland. The quartet were seen and signed by Reg Calvert, the manager of the Fortunes, after which they changed their name to Pinkertons Assorted Colors and adopted brightly colored costumes for their stage act. Their sound was an amalgam of folk and pop, highlighted by the use of an electric auto harp, which the band used in a manner somewhat similar to that of the Lovin' Spoonful. In late 1965, Pinkertons Assorted Colors were signed to Decca Records, and they cut their debut single that year with future Moody Blues producer Tony Clark. That record, Mirror Mirror, a song originally written by Tony Newman, became a number 8 British hit in 1966. They had one more minor chart entry, Don't Stop Loving Me Baby, later in the year, but that was their last hit. And after the failure of Magic Rocking Horse, they left Decca to sign with Pi Records. And even a name change to Pinkertons Colors didn't make their records more appealing. 4 subsequent singles between 1966 and 1968 did not trouble the charts at all. All their recordings shimmered with the amplified auto harp of Sam Pinkerton Kemp, and although the Downliners sect had used one occasionally, it was this innovation that was the group's main contribution to the rich tapestry of British beat music. Ian Coleman later replaced Barry Bernard, who joined Jigsaw, on the bass, but the group's days were numbered, and they faded away as the 1960s wore on. In 1968, after their failure with the Pie single Kentucky Woman, Pinkertons Colors, with Steve James now on lead guitar, transformed themselves into Pinkertons, and finally turned into Flying Machine, who released one album in a pop psychedelic mode in 1970. Despite their outlandish name, garish suits, and publicity stunts, such as pouring red dye in the fountains at Trafalgar Square, their success was limited.
I can see your pretty face.
7. The Mojo Men. One of the first bands to emerge from the San Francisco scene, the Mojo Men started off with British Invasion-style rock, but soon turned toward folky psychedelic pop. Despite some early success, they never quite made it. Here's why their mojo ran out. One of the earliest San Francisco rock bands, the Mojo Men, had local hits on the Autumn label with Dance With Me, She's My Baby, and a cover of the Rolling Stones' Off the Hook in the mid-60s. Their early sides displayed a raunchy but thin approach taken from the mold of British invasion groups like the Stones and Them. In 1966, after female drummer Jan Erico joined from the San Francisco folk rock group The Vegetables, they moved to Reprise and pursued folky psychedelic pop directions, and had a top 40 hit with a Baroque arrangement of Buffalo Springfield's Sit Down I Think I Love You in 1967. Singer-bassist Jim Alamo, née James Charles Alamo, 1938 to 1992, guitarist Paul Carrico, drummer Dennis Dakar, Podokar, and keyboardist Don Metchik were bandmates in Florida who moved to San Francisco in 1964 to form a new band. There they met Sylvester Stewart, later known as Sly Stone, then a record producer at Autumn Records for acts such as the Beau Brummels and the Vegetables. Stewart and the band recorded a few songs under the name Sly and the Mojo Men, but Stewart, unsatisfied with the results, chose not to release them. He continued working with the band as a songwriter and producer on Dance With Me, 1965, the Mojo Men's first song to enter the Billboard Hot 100 chart, and She's My Baby, 1966. The Mojo Men then moved from Autumn to Reprise Records, where the band's earlier British Invasion-influenced garage rock style evolved into pop-folk rock. In 1967, the band released a Baroque cover version of Buffalo Springfield's Sit Down I Think I Love You. Written by Stephen Stills and arranged by Van Dyke Parks, the song became the Mojo Men's first and only top 40 single. Metchik left the band in 1968, and the remaining trio shortened their name to the Mojo, and then just Mojo, before they released their lone studio album, Mojo Magic on GRT Records. The group disbanded in 1969. In their later days, they developed more intricate arrangements and harmonies that reflected the influence of the Mamas and the Papas and Jefferson Airplane, although they weren't in the same league as those groups. Their many singles never fully displayed the band's considerable songwriting and vocal talents. Sit Down, I Think I Love You was included on the seminal 1972 Nuggets, original artifacts from the first psychedelic era, 1965 to 1968 garage rock compilation album. Sun-Dazed Records released 3 Mojo Men compilation albums between 1995 and 2003, and in 2008, Big Beat Records released the compilation Not Too Old to Start Crying, the lost 1966 masters. The band's single, She's My Baby, was sampled on Kanye West's Hell of a Life, a song from his 2010 album My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. Curcio founded the Music America Studios in Rochester, New York, and produced Kill 'Em All, Metallica's debut solo album, 1983. He died on September 10th, 2018, at age 74. 6. The Osmonds. The Osmonds were America's favorite family band in the 60s and 70s with a string of hits and TV appearances. But behind the polished image was a story of shifting musical tastes, internal tensions, and financial troubles. How did it all go wrong? The Osmonds began building their musical empire in the early 60s as one of the world's most popular family bands. Siblings Alan, Wayne, Merrill, Jay, Donnie, Jimmy, and Marie Osmond established an act that became a staple on a number of variety shows and more. Keep scrolling to find out what happened in the famous family. The family's famous singing act first began as a quartet with just 4 Osmond siblings. Soon after, Donnie and Jimmy joined the group for performances on The Andy Williams Show. Marie made a few singing appearances with her brothers in the beginning stages of their band and was later encouraged by her mother to pursue a solo career. After signing with MGM Records, the group recorded the song One Bad Apple in 1970. The hit climbed to the top of the Billboard charts, marking the start of their music takeover. They toured the US and saw several of their songs like Down by the Lazy River and Crazy Horses gain popularity in Europe. Facing the shifting tides of the music industry, the Osmonds encountered significant challenges that tested their unity and adaptability. Their 5th album, The Plan, showcased their musical growth but deviated from the pop style that had initially won them fans. This change did not resonate well with their audience, creating a tough obstacle for the group. Further complicating matters, the older brothers expressed a desire to tour less and focus more on their personal lives, leading to internal changes within the band's dynamic. Concurrently, Donny Osmond pursued a solo career, while Marie and Jimmy also sought individual success. This led to increased competition on the charts, further straining the group's cohesion. Transitioning to television with the Donnie and Marie Show in 1976 introduced its own set of challenges, particularly financial strain. Producing the show was costly, and despite its initial success, the expenses weighed heavily on the family. When the show was eventually canceled, it led to significant setbacks, including Donny Osmond's separation from the group. These challenges and changes marked a critical phase in the Osmonds' journey, forcing them to navigate a complex landscape while striving to maintain their legacy in the music industry.
And I never know if I should stay or go away. It's a game that you play.
5. The Cowsills. The Cowsills were a real-life family band that inspired the Partridge Family, but their offstage drama and controlling father tore them apart. They had the talent, the looks, and the TV exposure. So why didn't they last? The Cowsills were an all-American family band best known for their 1967 hit The Rain, the Park, and Other Things. They formed around a nucleus of Billy, Bob, Barry, and John Cowsill. Then they were joined by younger siblings Paul and Susan and their mother Barbara, appearing on American chat and variety shows, and even securing their own TV special. The lone fly in their ointment was the family's patriarch, Bud Cowsill, a strict disciplinarian who struggled to control his temper and his drinking. Bob Cowsill told the Reno Dispatch, "Our dad was a tough guy. If you didn't say yes sir, you'd get smacked. He ruined the band and destroyed many of our lives. He wouldn't even let my twin brother Richard in the band. He and my dad had it in for each other. It was terrible that he wouldn't let Richard join in. I know it broke his heart." Their unique lineup and on-screen appeal had caught the eye of TV producers who wanted to create a series around the band. Bud scotched the deal, so they hired actors to play a family instead, creating the Partridge Family in the process. He also cost the band its lead singer, sacking Billy after the pair had a violent fight that nearly got Bud arrested. And he failed to put aside their earnings, so as soon as the hits dried up, so did the money. "The public never knew what was really going on in our family," said Bob. "We were all victims of his abuse, mental and physical. We would have had 20 more hits. We were just getting started." 4. The Ladybirds. There were a few bands called the Ladybirds in the 60s, but only one played topless. These New Jersey rockers became known for their scandalous performances, but there was more to them than a gimmick. Here's how they played their way into history. The Ladybirds was apparently quite the popular name for female pop groups in the 1960s. There were several all-girl bands in the 1960s named the Ladybirds, some of them who performed fully clothed, and some who did not. This lot were from New Jersey and were renowned for playing topless. However, this wasn't a novelty act. These Ladybirds could actually play in a garage rock fashion. Eventually, they went to Las Vegas and LA, where they were managed by top golfer Raymond Floyd. But let's narrow it down to just the Ladybirds who got their kits off, shall we? Leaving out a California-based group by that name who opened for the Stones for at least one performance during their 1965 US tour, and also the Ladybirds, an English all-girl vocal harmony group often seen on the Benny Hill Show. Now, as it turns out, there wasn't just a single band of topless Ladybirds either. There were two. What are the odds of that? First, we have the American Ladybirds, a garage rock group that was composed of 5 showgirls and began in San Francisco. Some sources say New Jersey, sometime in 1966. When they first started out, their act was just a T&A gimmick. I'm guessing one that was inspired by Charlotte Mormon's topless cello playing, then in the news, although topless waitresses were already a thing at that point, with the birds shaking their tail feathers and tits at punters, but miming along to backing tracks in places like the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas, LA's risque Blue Benny Club, and Tipsy's A Cabaret in San Francisco's then wild North Beach neighborhood, where they were booked for 14 solid months. Like the Monkees, eventually they learned how to play their own instruments. The band was originally conceived as a throwback girl group like the Shangri-Las. Flavors of surf, rockabilly, doo-wop, and retro bubblegum pop are all apparent in their music.
Well, we were all entertainers. We were dancing in San Francisco. Our manager thought of the idea, and he asked us each individually if we wanted to form a topless girl band. And we thought it was a great idea. So we said yes, and we started taking lessons, and the result you will see Monday night at 9 o'clock.
How many of you played musical instruments before that?
Just 2 of them. Barbara over here, she played folk guitar. She was a single on her own. And Deborah played classical piano. This is her first try at the rock and roll bag.
Is that what most of your music is, rock and roll?
It's kind of a combination. We do a couple of old standards, some old rock and roll tunes, some new ones, ballads, and a couple of fun tunes. You know, There's a lot to it. We have something for everybody. In more ways than one.
3. The Turtles. With their hit Happy Together, the Turtles captured the spirit of the 60s, but internal strife and management issues brought them down. Let's take a closer look at how one of America's most beloved bands unraveled at the height of their fame. The Turtles are an American rock band led by vocalists Howard Kaylan and Mark Volman, later known as Flo and Eddie. The band had several top 40 hits beginning in 1965 with their cover version of Bob Dylan's It Ain't Me Babe. They scored their biggest and best known hit in 1967 with the song Happy Together. The Turtles version became one of the most recognizable anthems of the 60s, despite the tunes having been turned down by both the Vogues and the Grassroots. All the more impressive when you realize that the pair were still teenagers at the time, and that by the time he was 22, the original Turtles had broken up. 1967 proved to be the Turtles' most successful year on the music charts. She'd Rather Be With Me reached number 3 on the US charts in late spring and actually outcharted Happy Together overseas, reaching number 4 in the UK. 2 successive top 15 songs followed, You Know What I Mean and She's My Girl. Both 45s signaled a certain shift in the band's style. Golden Hits was released later that year, charting in the top 10. The similar album covers for the Turtles' Golden Hits and its follow-up, More Golden Hits, were designed by Dean Torrance of Jan and Dean. As the Turtles' commercial success waned by the end of the 60s, they became plagued with management issues, lawsuits, and conflicts with their label White Whale Records, leading the group to break up in 1970. Kaylan and Volman then joined Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, where, for contractual reasons, they performed under the name Flo and Eddie. Volman as Flo, Kaylan as Eddie. After leaving Zappa at the end of 1971, Kaylan and Volman continued to perform under the Flo and Eddie name, becoming popular as a comedy rock act, and also went on to long-lasting success as session musicians. In 1983, Kaylan and Volman began touring as the Turtles featuring Flo and Eddie. Kaylan ceased touring in 2018, while Volman continues to tour with the Turtles. 2. AMM. AMM was one of the most experimental bands of the 60s, breaking every rule in music. With influences from jazz, classical, and avant-garde, they defied expectations and alienated most listeners. This is the story of the band that went too far. Proving that 1965 was the year music went weird, London's experimental free jazz art scene spawned the challenging, groundbreaking, and downright patience-testing concept of AMM music. Paul McCartney attended an improvisational performance in 1966 at the Royal College of Art. According to BeatlesBible.com, the audience numbered fewer than 20, and Paul made occasional sounds using a radiator and a beer mug. AMM was a British free improvisation group that was founded in London, England in 1965. The group was initially composed of Keith Rowe on guitar, Lou Gare on saxophone, and Eddie Prevost on drums. The three men shared an interest in exploring music beyond the boundaries of conventional jazz, as in free jazz and free improvisation. AMM never achieved widespread popularity but have been influential in improvised music. Most of their albums have been released by Matchless Recordings, which is run by Eddie Prevost. In a 2001 interview, Keith Rowe was asked if AMM was an abbreviation. He replied, "The letters AMM stand for something, but as you probably know, it's a secret." The seeds of AMM were planted in 1965. They initially had no name and were not really a group in the conventional sense, simply a weekend experimental workshop session at the Royal College of Art in London, centered on Gare, Rowe, and Prevost. Members of the group have come and gone over the years, but Rowe and Prevost have been present for most recordings and performances. The latter has been the only constant in the nearly 6 decades of AMM music. Musicians were free to join in, but such collaborations were often short-lived if the contributions were lacking the proper spirit. Notable jazz saxophonist Steve Lacy sat in with the group, but was quickly asked to stop playing. Observers were welcome, provided they were silent and did not disturb the proceedings. American saxophonist Ornette Coleman was asked to leave after he continually talked during one performance. Beatles member Paul McCartney once sat quietly through an early AMM session. When asked how he liked the music, he said they went on too long. Eventually, the group settled on a lineup of Prevost, Rowe, Gare, bassist Lawrence Sheaf, and pianist-cellist Cornelius Cardew, and in early 1966 were calling themselves AMM. No AMM performance is ever planned. Each is unique and spontaneous. The musicians tend to avoid any conventional melody, harmony, or rhythm and seek out an ensemble sound that often obscures any individual's role. It is often difficult to discern which musical instrument is making which specific sound on an AMM recording, due in part to liberal use of various extended techniques on their instruments. AMM released their first recording, AMM Music, 1966, on Elektra Records in the UK. It had some initial similarities to free jazz, due in part to Gare's saxophone. One critic has written, however, that the resemblance was rather slight. The overall sound of the group, even in 1966, was so different, so idiosyncratic, that it's not at all surprising that both new jazz and contemporary classical audiences were baffled, if not horrified. Percussionist Christopher Hobbs, born in 1950 and a student of Cardew, also played with AMM in the late 1960s. 1. The Shags. They're often called the worst band of all time, but the Shags story is as fascinating as it is bizarre. Forced into music by their father's prophecy, these sisters made an album so strange it's become legendary. Here's the wild tale of the Shags. The Shags were a sister act from rural New Hampshire founded in 1968, featuring Dorothy Dot Wiggin on vocals and lead guitar, Betty Wiggin on vocals and rhythm guitar, and Helen Wiggin on drums. They were later joined by their sister Rachel on bass. The group came together in 1968 at the insistence of their father, Austin Wiggin, who claimed his mother had foretold that someday he would have daughters who would have a band. To fulfill his vision, Austin prevented the girls from going to school, kept them from making friends outside the family, and, perhaps counterintuitively, wouldn't allow them to listen to music, as the sisters told BBC4 interviewer John Ronson in 2011. To make his dreams come true, Austin made them practice day and night and staged weekly shows for them in their small town of Fremont, New Hampshire. When Dorothy, Betty, and Helen Wiggin went into a recording studio on March 9, 1969, they had no idea that they would be writing a small chapter in rock history or inspiring a stage musical. To be fair, even the biggest fans of the sisters, who are better known as the Shags, would probably admit the album recorded that day, Philosophy of the World, belongs on a short list for the worst music ever committed to vinyl. Songs like the title cut, Who Are Parents, and My Pal Foot Foot, a ditty about a lost cat that begins and ends with drum solos, are sloppy and uncoordinated. The whole mess sounds like three people picking up their instruments for the first time and recording in isolated chambers without hearing what the others are playing. Despite that, or maybe because of it, the group's fan base has included luminaries like Frank Zappa, Kurt Cobain, Bonnie Raitt, and Joy Gregory, the playwright for The Shags, Philosophy of the World, a stage musical based on the life of the Wiggin sisters that premiered June 7, 2017 at Playwrights Horizon's Main Stage Theater in New York City. The difference between Gregory and the aforementioned musical greats is critical, at least where the Shags are concerned. For Gregory, there's more to the Shags story than meets the eye. It's not just about a trio of teenage sisters who couldn't really play their instruments, but don't let them stop them from recording an album so crappy it's considered one of the worst of all time, and in the process attract a small but loyal fan base that likes it because it's so bad. There are huge American themes in this story, she said. You have a domineering father sacrificing his daughter's teenage years for the sake of a prophecy made by their grandmother. This father, Austin, is similar to Arthur Miller's character. He's an example of the frustrated American dream. In real life, Austin Wiggin was the Shags Svengali. His mother predicted that he would have 3 daughters who would grow up to be famous. He was very strict about the girls practicing and even homeschooled them so they could spend more time practicing. Not that it made any difference to the average listener. Reportedly, the recording engineers at the session turned off the sound in the control booth so Austin and his daughters wouldn't hear the cackling. At one point, the band stopped mid-song, and when the engineers asked why, Austin reportedly snapped, "Because they made a mistake." The engineers were shocked, considering what they heard sounded like nothing but mistakes. Gregory has been working on the musical for the better part of a decade, and while the story is basically the truth, there have been some changes made for artistic reasons, such as making drummer Helen, who in reality was the oldest sister, into the youngest. In real life, she's the oldest sister, but she's also the most vulnerable. So thematically, it just seemed right to make her the youngest, she said. She also is mute in much of the play, and part of that is to convey her struggle with depression. I didn't have much contact with the sisters out of choice, but I did convey my reasons for doing this, and they approved. Another key detail is to not feature much of the now legendary recordings in the play. Instead, the songs are originals that are written to reflect how the sisters' music sounds to them. They're at once the worst group you've ever heard and almost the most inspiring. For almost 50 years, the Shags, 3 sisters from New Hampshire, have confused and enthralled people with, well, whatever it was they did. The New Yorker published this article on them in 1999. Definitely worth the read. Depending on whom you ask, the Shags were either the best band of all time or the worst. Frank Zappa is said to have proclaimed that the Shags were better than the Beatles. More recently, though, a music fan who claimed to be in the fetal position writhing in pain declared on the internet that the Shags were hauntingly bad and added, "I would walk across the desert while eating charcoal briquettes soaked in Tabasco for 40 days and 40 nights, not to ever have to listen to anything Shag related ever again." Such a divergence of opinion confuses the mind. Listening to the Shags album Philosophy of the World will further confound. The music is winsome but raggedly discordant pop. Something is sort of wrong with the tempo, and the melodies are squashed and bent, nasal, deadpan. Are the Shags referencing the heptatonic angular microtones of Chinese Yayue court music and the atonal note clusters of Ornette Coleman? Or are they just a bunch of kids playing badly on cheap, out-of-tune guitars? And what about their homely, blunt lyrics? Consider the song Things I Wonder. There are many things I wonder. There are many things I don't. It seems as though the things I wonder most are the things I never find out. Is this the colloquial ease and dislocated syntax of a James Schuyler poem? Or the awkward, innermost thoughts of a speechless teenager?
When I feel sad, there are times when I feel blue. What makes me feel?
Thanks for watching. If you loved this dive into music's forgotten past, hit that like button and subscribe for more wild music stories. Check out our other videos for more throwbacks and deep dives. See you next time.